Okay, so here let's graph these tangent curves. So first let's graph y equals 2 of tangent. So notice here that there's only a multiplication of 2. So let's start off by graphing the general tangent curve. So remember the tangent curve, it starts at negative pi over 2 and it ends at pi over 2. There's asymptotes there. And then at negative pi over 4, you're at negative 1. At 0, you're at 0. And at pi over 4, you are at 1. Okay, so as long as you can remember these shapes or remember like what the graph kind of looks like, you should be okay. Now, the next thing that you want to be able to do is you want to multiply this by the so-called amplitude. Now, in this case, there's really no amplitude because you have this 2, but you can still do it. Now, the way that you're going to do it is you're going to multiply these guys by 2. So this guy right here, so nothing's going to happen to the asymptotes. Okay, the asymptotes stay the same. Here's negative pi over 2. Here's pi over 2. The asymptotes are going to stay there. Okay, so at negative pi over 4 and at pi over 4, that's when this is going to change. So this guy is no longer a negative 1. Now it's going to be a negative 2. Okay, so you're stretching this guy. This guy is 0. It's going to stay at 0. This guy is at 1. You're going to go up to 2. So basically what you did is you kind of made it a little more linear. So now it looks really like a line. Okay, there's still a little bit of curvature, but it looks more like a line. Okay. All right, so now let's look at this next thing. Now notice here the 2 now is in the inside. Okay, so when it's in the inside, what you got to look at is you got to look at where exactly is 1 period. So 1 period for the sine and the cosine was from 0 to 2 pi. 1 period for this guy would be from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So this is the guy that we're going to be using for the tangent. So we have that negative pi over 2 less than x less than pi over 2. So here where the asymptotes are at, we're going to be the new asymptotes. So you're going to have 2x in here, negative pi over 2, and then pi over 2. I'm going to divide by 2 to all 3 sides. So what I'm going to have is negative pi over 4 and pi over 4. So that means that my asymptotes now are going to be from pi over 4, negative pi over 4 to pi over 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and graph that. So, so I'm going to have my new set of asymptotes are going to be from negative pi over 4 to pi over 4. That's where my new set of asymptotes are going to be at. Okay, now what are going to be my midpoints? Well, this one's clearly 0. Now, what is this new endpoint? So if I take negative pi over 2 plus 0, negative pi over 4 plus 0 divided by 2. So doing the same thing, I'm going to have negative pi over 8. So this guy right here is negative pi over 8. So that means that the other side must be positive pi over 8. Here, there's no shifting or stretching. Okay, so it's just going to be 1. So these haven't changed. But these are now going to belong to this negative pi over 8. And then the 0 stays the same. So the graph kind of looks like this. Okay, so that's what it looks like. So we're only graphing 1 period of this. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so notice that it's exactly the same thing that we've been doing with the sine and the cosine, but now the formulas are just a little bit different. Okay, so now let's try this one. Y equals 3x plus pi. So what we're going to do, we're going to take this 3x plus pi, and we're going to put it in between the asymptotes, which is going to be negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. Because remember that the asymptotes are between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. Are at negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So we're going to put the argument inside the x. So now let's solve where the new asymptotes are going to be at. So subtract by pi to all sides. Okay, so I'm going to take negative pi over 2, and I'm going to subtract it by pi. And what I'm going to get is negative 3 pi over 2 less than 3x less than, then we're going to take pi over 2, and we're going to subtract pi. And we're going to get negative pi over 2. Okay. And then finally, we're just going to divide by 3. So you're going to have x is going to be between. This guy is just going to give me negative pi over 2. And this guy's going to give me negative pi over 6. Okay, so this is going to be where my new set of asymptotes, okay? So the new set of asymptotes is going to be in this interval, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start graphing it. So notice that there's no amplitude here, or there's no stretching factor, okay? So all we got to do is figure out where negative pi over 2 and negative pi over 6 is. So here is negative pi over 2, and this is going to be negative pi over 6. Let's start off by finding the midpoint. So I'm going to take negative pi over 2, add it to negative pi over 6, and divide it by 2. Okay, so I'm going to take this negative pi over 2, and I'm going to add it to this pi over 6, and I'm going to divide it by 2. And what I'm going to get is negative pi over 3. So negative pi over 3 will be right here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this negative pi over 3 and add it to this negative pi over 2. So negative pi over 2 plus negative pi over 3 divided by 2. Okay. Negative pi over 2. And then I'm going to subtract or add it to pi over 3 and divide it by 2. That's going to give me negative 5 pi over 12. So right here is negative 5 pi over 12. And then finally, we're going to do this last one, okay, which is going to be this negative pi over 3 plus negative pi over 6 divided by 2. So negative pi over 3 plus negative pi over 6 divided by 2, that's just going to give me negative pi over 4. Okay. So there we go. That's basically what this guy is. Okay. So now all we have to do now is try to figure out what the tangent kind of looks like. Know that the tangent is going to have asymptotes at these endpoints. Okay, so there's going to be asymptotes there. So asymptotes there. And then all we got to think about is what the pattern was. Okay, so it's negative 1, 0, and 1. So this guy's going to have the negative 1, this guy's going to have the 0, and this guy's going to have the 1. So all we got to do is just graph this. So graphing it like this. Whatever that might look like. Okay, and we're only wanting one period of that. Okay. All right, so now let's do this last one. So we're going to have to negative 2 tangent of x minus pi over 2. Okay, so this one, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. So the first thing that you kind of have to look at is figure out the asymptotes. So remember that the asymptotes are going to be between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. We're going to plug in the argument x minus pi over 2 in here. And now let's add the pi over 2 over. So this is going to go away. This is a 0, x, and this is going to be pi over 2 plus pi over 2. That's going to be pi. Okay, so you have a 0 to pi. So this is where the new asymptotes are going to be for the tangent. Okay, so if I look at it, I have 0 to pi. Thankfully, this is really nice to figure out the midpoint. So this will be pi over 2. This will be pi over 4. And this will be 3 pi over 4. So these weren't that terrible. Okay, so the asymptotes, remember, are going to be at 0 and at pi. Okay, so here are the asymptotes. Okay, now before I start drawing the regular one, notice that there's an amplitude change there's a negative 2 in there, okay? So before, remember that there was a 1 and a negative, a 1 and a negative 1. Now this guy is going to be at a 2. So initially, before, this pi over 4, or the first point was at negative 1. It's not going to be a negative 1 now. It's going to be at positive 2. So now it's being flipped, okay? That pi over 2 is going to be 0. And that 3 pi over 4 is going to be negative 2. So you can kind of see that there's going to be a flip in the tangent curve. And there's also going to be a stretch there. So you can kind of see from, in relation to the previous graph, you see that this was going from bottom to the top. Now in this case, it's going from the top to the bottom. Okay, so it's being flipped, and that's basically what this negative is doing. And then this 2 just stretched the whole thing from a 1 to a 2. Now we're not done yet, because we also have this this positive 1. So we are increasing everything by a unit of 1. Okay, so now let's go ahead and increase everything. So now this guy, so the x values are still the same: 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and then pi. So the asymptotes are the same. And then everything is going to be shifted up 1 unit. It's positive 1, positive 2, positive 3. So notice that this guy was at 2. I'm going to shift it up 1 unit. So now this is at 3. This guy was at 0. I'm going to shift it up 1 unit. So now I'm at 1. This guy is at negative 2. I'm going to shift it up 1 unit. So I'm at negative 1. Okay, so when I graph it, it's going to look something like this. Okay, I'm terrible at drawing. Oh my God. Okay, so that's basically what it looks like. So as long as you can give me these key points and then the graph with the shifting, you should be okay.